What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a meta-analysis for the brand new November 2017 format. We have a lot to discuss because this past weekend, ARG St. Louis took place and actually was abiding by the new ban list. And this is a really big deal because this is a first glimpse at what the format might look like as we move forward and progress forward. But, you know, a lot of people may not place a lot of weight in ARGs because some people don't consider them to be, you know, premier competitive events, but on the other side of that argument, because they do cash prizing, the more competitive players are attracted to these tournaments, and sure, they may not get the huge turnouts of something like a YCS, but even though they're smaller, the player, I guess, skill gap is much higher, and so there's a lot more competitive players competing at these events. So there is something that we can take from this, and it's going to have some influence on YCS San Diego, as well as YCS Prague and YCS Argentina, in some form or another, whether we like it or not. So I felt it's very important to discuss. So what happened is that yes, SPYRAL was the dominant deck. I'll have the pie chart up here, but even though SPYRAL was the dominant deck, taking up only 7 of the top 16 slots, we actually had a relatively diverse top 16. I mean, you look at this pie chart and there's SPYRAL, there's Pendulum Magician, there's Trickstar, there's Infernoid, there's True Draco, there's a ton of different decks in here. I think in total there's 7 different decks, and yeah, sure, SPYRAL is still the dominant deck, at least in this top 16 cut representation, but when you look at it, this is much better than where we were only a couple weeks ago, where SPYRAL was just absolutely shitting on everything. So that's an improvement from where we've been before, but did it really solve the problem? Because with the implementation of the November 2017 list, you know, people were hoping that SPYRAL was going to just kind of be brought down on the level of some of these other decks. And some people might argue by looking at this that yeah, SPYRAL's been brought down, but the fact that it still has the highest representation tells me that it is still the most dominant deck. Now, a lot of people going into this, I'm assuming, were expecting and anticipating that Pendulum Magician was going to be the deck to beat, because if you look at some of these decks, and we'll get into this a little bit later, the decks were tailored more towards Pendulum Magician than SPYRAL at first glance. Now, I do want to talk about SPYRAL to start off because, again, it did have 7 of the top 16 cut, and it's a really big deal because this ban list was essentially made to put SPYRAL in check, with Drone going to 1, Quick Fix going to 1, Gofu going to 1, as well as Set Rotation going to 1. Now, the deck did become a lot more reliant on double summon, as well as Foolish Burial Goods, which acts as a pseudo double summon by sending the SPYRAL Mission Assault to the graveyard to bestow you with that extra summon, giving you those 2 monsters to go into your double helix and go off with your plays. I personally believe the deck was very fragile, but it apparently isn't fragile enough because the boards that it is able to create are still absolutely amazing and are good enough to make it still be considered the best deck. Now, there is one thing you guys do need to take note of, and is that the deck is more fragile than it's ever been before. Essentially, any hand trap going up against SPYRAL, if you use it mid-combo to interrupt them, is going to just flat out destroy them, whereas before, because of cards like Machine Duplication and, you know, having Quick Fix and Drone being at 3 copies, the deck was able to play around multiple hand traps if it had the right extenders in those instances. But now, basically any hand trap is going to absolutely stop the combo, and you might see that even though in some of the deck lists from this event, some players weren't maxing out on so many hand traps as before, but I think as we might see in YCS San Diego, that people are still going to want to play a very significant amount of hand traps because they are so valuable in your SPYRAL matchup that they can just completely shut down their plays, that running as many as you possibly can fit in your deck and being able to stop them so that you can proceed with your plays on the following turn is going to be invaluable. When you look at some of these deck lists, some players were only playing like 4 hand traps, some players were playing like 6, and then others were playing sometimes 10 if not more, but I think the trend is that you're going to start seeing hand traps go back up in popularity solely because of how fragile SPYRAL is and how effective they are in that matchup, considering that SPYRAL is still the most dominant deck of this format. But interestingly enough, SPYRAL actually didn't win the event, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, moving on to the next piece of the pie chart, Pendulum Magician, again, like I said, was kind of what a lot of people were anticipating, because it just kind of makes sense that, again, a deck like SPYRAL gets hit. Pendulum Magician was the former best deck, so a lot of people were thinking, okay, it's tried and true, and we know it works. But only 2 of them managed to make the top cut, and even though the deck is still incredibly strong, it does have a lot of weaknesses. It loses very hard to evenly matched. You know, it's very easy to side against, and when you look at it in the context of some of these other decks, it's still a very powerful deck, but it's really hard to gauge whether or not it's still going to be the absolute power force that it used to be in its past. I definitely think it's a solid option going into YCS San Diego, but it has a lot of roadblocks that it has to overcome just because of the inherent weaknesses that the deck has, especially when you're going into games 2 and 3. Then the next deck was Trickstar, and Trickstar, believe it or not, actually managed to take first place at this event, and that's absolutely crazy. Now, the thing that contributed to Trickstar's success is the fact that it was able to run anywhere from 10 to 11 hand traps, but the interesting thing is as well, is that if you look at the 2 different Trickstar builds that were in the top 16 cut, both of them were built very differently. The player who won, Joel White, he was playing a lot of hand traps, where the other Trickstar player was actually taking a completely different approach to the Trickstar strategy as well. And I think that's what's really cool about Trickstar, is that it's a deck that's very adaptable, and you can do a lot of different things with it because the main core engine is so small, kind of very reminiscent of Zodiac, but obviously, you know, not that utterly broken. But it's kind of cool that you can play a lot of, you know, splashable generic cards in a Trickstar deck, so it has the ability to be flexible depending on what the meta is shaping into. So in the case, if SPYRAL's a dominant deck, Trickstar can main a lot of hand traps, and it doesn't really wreck the deck's consistency because the engine is just so minuscule. It's really easy to accommodate playing cards like that. Trickstar is definitely a formidable threat going into the future of this format, because it's a deck that a lot of people might not be siding for, and ultimately it's a deck that can take a lot of people by surprise, and it's still really good at what it does. It may not have a win condition, but ultimately it's a deck that has obviously proven it's capable of competing in this format. We saw it doing well last format, even though SPYRAL was just obviously dominating everything, but the fact that Trickstar was able to keep up in that format tells me that it's going to have a much better time in this format as well. Now, the next piece of the pie, we had Burning Abyss. We had 2 Burning Abyss players, Noah Green taking first place after Swiss at this event, and there was another Burning Abyss player who played a Burning Abyss PK Fire variant as well. And that's really cool because, again, very similarly to Trickstar, we have 2 different variants of kind of a take on the same deck. Now, Burning Abyss is really interesting because it's a deck that can play around hand traps very well. It's a deck that really one hand trap doesn't really do much against, because, I mean, you look at the hand trap lineup. I mean, Droll and Lockbird doesn't really do anything. Ash and Ghost Ogre have a very minimal effect. Sure, you could argue that Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries is probably the most devastating, but some people weren't even siding Dante or having Dante in their extra deck for their Ghost Reaper to be able to hit the Dante in the Burning Abyss player's extra deck. Now, this might be something that people catch on to and change and adapt with when it comes to stuff like YCS San Diego, but it's still a deck that is capable, it's very consistent, and it's able to just pretty much do things that other decks in this format can't. And with the way that these decks are functioning, it's very difficult for them to deal with the amount of floaters and just the amount of grind game that Burning Abyss has at its disposal. So I'm really curious to see in the future if Burning Abyss makes even a bigger resurgence, or if this was more of just kind of a one-time thing. Because, I mean, we did see at YCS London that Michael Foreigner did make top 8 with Burning Abyss, and that was, again, when SPYRAL was at its prime, very similarly to Trickstar. So I'm curious to see that if people are going to pretty much catch on and really think that Burning Abyss is a viable anti-meta strategy going into this upcoming format. Then there was 3 other decks that managed to get 1 deck each in the top 16. There was a True Draco list, there was a Lightsworn Infernoid list, and there was a Paleozoic list. Now, the True Draco list was obviously catered against Pendulum Magician because it was main decking copies of Unending Nightmare, which, again, that's totally for Pendulum Magician more than anything. But again, True Draco is a deck that Masterpiece pretty much is a very big problem in this format. Now sure, Pendulum Magician can deal with it rather easily, and Spiral can to an extent. Obviously it hurts a lot now that the deck has lost 2 copies of Drone, as well as its ability to do machine duplication plays, but Masterpiece is still a really big deal, especially in the context of some of these other meta decks that you're seeing make this top cut. So I wouldn't be surprised and count out True Draco. And this is also a build that didn't utilize the Invoked engine. This was more of a Demise build. So again, there's still a lot of room for experimentation when it comes to the True Draco department. And then Paleozoic Frog, again, Paleozoic is that sleeper deck that you never know if it's capable of doing and just performing well, and in this case it did manage to make top 16. It's able to main deck stuff like Evenly Matched because you're playing a fuckload of traps anyway, and it's able to just pretty much grind out your opponent's resources more often than not. It is more of a go first deck, but it can go second very well on the other side of things, just because it doesn't really function going second very similarly to a lot of other decks. It's a very reactive deck, and that works a lot in its favor. Not to mention that Totally Awesome is still a really big fucking deal. Now, obviously, Evenly Matched is something that a lot of these decks do have to worry about, and some decks handle it better than others, but pretty much a majority of the players in this top cut, which then we can extrapolate and assume a majority of the players at the ARG in general were playing Evenly Matched, you're going to be seeing a lot of Evenly Matched. So this is kind of where you have to solve the format and figure out how your deck best handles a card like Evenly Matched. And one of the biggest things that players were utilizing to combat it was Solemn Scolding. Now, Solemn Scolding saw play in several of the side decks of the top 16 players, and that's because it's kind of that line of defense where not only can it stop any other card your opponent has, but it also can stop Evenly Matched, meaning you're not going to get completely blown out by that card. And I think that's really good because Solemn Scolding has that flexibility in its ability to just hit multiple things. If they don't have the Evenly Matched, you can stop something like a very important spell effect, like let's say a board wipe, or anything else that might be a threat to the rest of your board. And then say in the instance of Spiral, you've already got Tri-Gate Wizard, so that's one negate they have to play through. Solemn Scolding can just be that second negate that can just lock the game up entirely, and then your opponent's just gonna flat out lose. That's why we saw the surge in pricing of Solemn Scolding. It's now anywhere from like a $10 to $15 card, and you're going to be seeing this card being played a lot in the future of this format. But guys, that's it for my meta analysis. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this meta analysis as a whole. Again, I know we only have this ARG kind of for reference at this point, and I'm going to modify the meta analysis kind of as we move forward, but I think this is a very interesting starting point considering this is the first event of this new format, and there is a lot of experimentation here because, yes, Spiral is the dominant deck, but I think there's a lot of room for ingenuity and creativity here to kind of experiment with some other different strategies to see how they might be viable in the future of this format. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you really found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.